Dr. Esposito is on our faculty here at WashU in sociology. Mike investigates racialized social systems and their institutions, how they are configured that layers privilege on white population and hazards on minoritized population. His research ultimately seeks to understand how these systematically distributed privileges and penalties affect population health. He works closely with his colleague, Jessica Finlay. Dr. Finlay is at the Institute of Social Research at the University of Michigan. She's a health geographer and environmental gerontologist. She investigates how built social and natural environments affect health and well-being, lifestyle behaviors, and quality of life. I'm really looking forward to hearing how this team of researchers works together on this very important topic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Just want to make sure everyone can see my screen. Okay, I'm seeing some nods. Perfect. Thanks, Mike. All right. Okay, so I'm going to dive right in since we have a lot to cover. Mike and I have an ambitious plan to share 5 papers in 45 minutes. So we're just going to go right in. So today we're going to talk about our process towards building cognability, which is an ecological theory of neighborhoods and cognitive aging. So I'm going to give an introduction to our work, our context, kind of our framing, as well as aging in place, and some of our mixed methods research. Mike's going to take over and kind of present our full cognability, theoretical and empirical work, and then the future scientific directions that we're taking. And then we really look forward to Q&A and discussion after that. So a brief background and framing for the talk today. Mike and I together really focus on neighborhoods, health, and aging. So we're very interdisciplinary scholars. We are blending theories, methods, and approaches from geography, public health, gerontology, and sociology. We're also using mixed methods research. So we're pairing in-depth qualitative insights from methods such as interviews, ethnography, and focus groups with more broad and generalizable, often national scale data gathered through quantitative studies. And then we pair those together, and you're going to see examples of papers that are purposely pairing together qualitative and quantitative data to answer our research questions. We take kind of a multi-scalar approach to health and well-being. So we kind of see someone's individual health and capacities, such as their biology, lifestyle, capital, and social support, as nested within multiple environments. These are overlapping, but I've separated them out in this diagram just to show some examples of key environments that we investigate. So we look at, for example, the built environment, elements such as housing, what services and amenities are available locally, sidewalk quality and availability, as well as transportation networks and infrastructure. This is nested within a social environment that we found different ways to measure elements such as social cohesion and cultural norms and systemic racism, which again are filtering to inform what the built environment looks like. So it can be very unequal across communities as shaped, for example, by systemic racism and systemic classism. We've also looked at the natural environment, elements such as whether you have access to parks, views of nature or water in your local area, and weather and climate. It's not just does that sidewalk exist, for example, but is it covered in snow and unplowed for weeks or months of a year? And then that is also nested and overlapping with the political environment. And some examples that are relevant to kind of aging and gerontological work, for example, is age-friendly efforts and policymaking, as well as gentrification. Aging in place is a very popular concept. We always hear, for example, that the majority of older adults want to age in their homes and communities. Here are 2 examples. One is from 2019 survey where 2 in 3 older adults have a goal to age in place. Another poll from 2022 found that 88% believe that it's important to age in place. So there's a widespread desire to stay where if you have the economic privilege, where you're connected to your communities, your family if they live nearby, friends, and services. You know, for example, where a light switch is in the middle of the night. But realistically, that can be quite difficult to achieve. And actually, I was thinking about in your announcements about how the non-financial aspects of retirement, the ability to age in place is not always planned for or able to achieve. So if you think about a lot of houses, for example, bedrooms are on the second floor, you might have laundry in the basement, key services and amenities like grocery stores, doctor's offices, pharmacies, they're often located up to miles away. And so in this study, they found that only 1 in 3 older adults believe they'll realistically be able to age in place. And here, 1 in 3 adults aged 50 to 80 said their home definitely has the features, but 47% it probably does, and 90% says it does not. So there might be a desire to age your homes and communities, but not so the ability to do so. So just a little bit about my background, and then I'll come to how Mike and our paths intersected. So I was really interested in aging in place in my early scholarly days, and I conducted a research project on aging in place across the Minneapolis metropolitan area, asking folks what services and amenities they felt were necessary to support them, and then comparing that to the policymakers and service providers, their opinions and provisions. And that really led to my interest in providing supportive, accessible, and more equitable communities for our large and growing aging population. Now, one of the biggest fears that individuals talked about was fears of cognitive decline, a very relatable fear of losing yourself, your independence, and your ability to live at home and in your community. Folks talked about, for example, what if I cause a house fire? What if I leave the stove unattended? What if I start to wander? What if I am if I become a burden upon my family and friends or need really costly institutional care? So at the time, I hadn't thought much about Alzheimer's and dementia, but that was in my study of aging in place, one of the largest fears that folks talked about. And then my own life since then is also, as I'm sure many on this call, I have had multiple family members affected by Alzheimer's and dementia. Just for anyone unfamiliar, to make sure we're on the same page. So dementia is an umbrella term for loss of memory and other thinking abilities that become severe enough to interfere with daily life. Alzheimer's disease is the most common, and more than 6 million Americans over the age of 65 are currently estimated to be living with Alzheimer's disease. There was a large international effort in the Lancet to kind of combine international studies of potentially modifiable risk factors for dementia. And they identified across the life course 12 factors, such as having less education in early life. They've identified midlife factors such as hearing loss and traumatic brain injury, and then later life factors such as smoking and depression. And they found that theoretically, 40% of dementia cases worldwide could be prevented or delayed by addressing these risk factors. Now, as scholars who are, oh, sorry, I forgot I had those bigger, apologies. For scholars such as Mike and I, who are really focused on upstream contextual factors and neighborhood communities, when we look at this report, we think, okay, how can environment structure these risk factors? Some are more obvious than others. So for example, air pollution is one of probably the most common area of environmental risk factors for dementia and Alzheimer's diseases. But we think about more the lifestyle factors. So how can an environment encourage someone, for example, to be socially connected or to be physically active or to not engage in smoking practices? And so that's kind of our framing and how we think through upstream factors that may be involved in the very unequal disparities we see across our communities for Alzheimer's disease. How are neighborhoods and communities and their unequal privileges and opportunities and hazards, how might those be involved in cognitive aging and Alzheimer's and dementia risk? So this led us to the Cognability project. We started off in Michigan together. I know you hate this photo, sorry, Mike. It was a really interdisciplinary effort. The first aim was to investigate built and social neighborhood features linked to cognitive function and decline, and then to translate this into a new kind of theoretical concept of cognability and to develop some public mapping tool efforts to make this more accessible to everyday folks. And this work is supported by a variety of grants from NIH as well as Michigan funding sources. And we work closely with one of our mentors, Dr. Philippa Clark at the University of Michigan as well through this work. One of the sources of inspiration for cognability is walkability. So we see this kind of as a blend of public health and geography, and it's really become very accessible. I mean, when you look at houses on Zillow, for example, you can see what the walk score is. So walkability has become kind of a publicly understood concept where we think about how built environmental features such as, what does the crosswalk look like? Are there trees for comfort and shading? Are there sidewalks to allow walking? It really kind of intuitively shows folks a connection between a neighborhood environment and resulting health behaviors. So we wanted to kind of build off of this, but think through cognitive health. So that led us to develop a new word, and we'll hope through this point of this talk, you'll understand cognability by the end in full, but it's a vision of how supportive an area is to cognitive health through built and social environmental features that encourage physical activity, social connection, and cognitive stimulation in later life. And this is just an early kind of brainstorming vision that we had of both macro to micro environmental features that may be relevant to these health behaviors in later life. So having, for example, community centers and libraries, or having mixed use spaces or well-designed crosswalks. So that micro to macro feature is kind of our goal long-term of what cognability might work to incorporate. The big question, though, is what specific neighborhood features are relevant to these, healthy cognitive aging and these lifestyle behaviors? It's not a lot of research has been done in some of these areas. So for this, we turn to a mixed methods approach to try to answer these questions and look for links to cognitive aging outcomes. So we used a mixed methods approach and explanatory sequential design. So first, we built upon my Minnesota-based work through qualitative data collection and analysis, and that informed hypothesis testing in a quantitative sample. So in the qualitative work, we asked where and how do older adults socialize, exercise, and engage in cognitive stimuli activities outside of their homes. And that was building upon the Aging in the Right Place study, which I'll introduce in a couple of slides to follow. That led us to develop hypotheses, which we could then test in a large national aging sample, regards the reasons for geographic and racial differences in stroke study. So we then tested is availability of and access to these neighborhood sites were identified in the qualitative analysis associated with cognitive function in the regard sample. The qualitative sample was collected in 2015 to 2016. It involved interviews in 3 case study areas across the Minneapolis metropolitan area. So you can see downtown Minneapolis is in green, North Minneapolis is in blue, and Eden Prairie is in orange. So purposely contrasting types of built environment from a very dense downtown environment to a more low density suburban environment, as well as the demographics of folks who live in each of these communities. Instead of just sitting in a room and asking people to tell me what mattered to them, I also asked them to show it to me. So folks could participate afterwards in about a 15 to 20 minute mobile interview of their home and or their neighborhood. For some, this was a space of a room or their apartment or their house. Others, I remember in Eden Prairie on a very hot day, walking around an entire lake. Now, the interviews were kind of a snapshot of someone's life in a particular season, in a particular moment or day. So to begin to understand experiences in different places over time, I also conducted ethnography with a subset of 6 participants, 2 per case study area over the course of a year. And we did everyday things together like exercise, socialize, attend faith services, go to the doctor, take care of family members, and just spend time together. And I'm actually still in contact with several of these participants all these years later. These participants were on average 71 years old. They were 2/3 female, 1/3 male. 57% identified as white and 25% as Black. 1/3 were married, 2/3 not married, and 57% had maximum high school education. I should also note that about a quarter of individuals were living in subsidized housing, and 1/3 of individuals were living alone. Onto the quantitative sample. Again, this is the regard study. So this is a sample over 30,000 non-Hispanic Black and white adults across the continental United States. It's been ongoing since 2003, and participants on average were 64 years at baseline. The regard study is doing annual follow-up. So we know, for example, their physical and mental health outcomes over time. They're conducting cognitive testing, which I'll go into more on the next slide. And we also know where they live. So we know their addresses throughout the course of the study, down to a latitude, longitude coordinate, which we can then geocode to measure their neighborhood exposures. For cognitive testing, we didn't have a domain-specific hypothesis. This is very early work to look at kind of neighborhoods from this perspective and cognitive aging outcomes. So we wanted to use all sources of information available to us in the regard study. So we created a kind of composite of global cognitive function, and this tested for different domains such as language and executive function, as assessed by the animal and letter fluency test. Learning and memory through wordless learning and wordless delayed, as well as recall and orientation, which was through the MOCA, a subset of items from the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. So we put all these together to use every kind of piece of information available to us to develop a global cognitive function score for all active regards participants. So our quantitative sample, sorry, your faces are all in the way of some of my key details. There we go. It was about 21,000 individuals. I should note that we restricted this to urban and suburban dwelling regards participants to match our qualitative hypotheses. Rural cognability is an important concept, but it needs its own set of kind of efforts. And that's a separate project that we're actually working on together right now. These participants were on average 67 years old. They were just over half, 56% female, 60% identified as white, 40% Black, 60% had maximum high school education. Global cognitive function, it's not very intuitive when you kind of build a composite score, but the point is that the scores vary quite widely across individuals in the study. So how we conducted our analyses was, again, a two-step process for these building block papers. So we looked at, in the qualitative analysis, how and why participants perceived and used their local environments. And then Mike led the quantitative analysis, and we used a variety of approaches. Again, we had that global cognitive function score. We've happy to talk in Q&A about measuring neighborhoods. It's really complex. We've used a variety of approaches. That includes kernel density, a buffer around someone's home location, as well as their census tracts. We've conducted analysis on folks active in the study between 2006 and 2017. That's when we had their cognitive testing. And we adjusted for a variety of individual and area level covariates such as age, gender, race, and education. And at the census tract level, population density, proportion living below the poverty line, and proportion non-Hispanic Black. So let's dive in. As I mentioned, measuring neighborhoods is very complex. And also, Mike and I are both pretty new to measuring cognitive aging when we started our postdocs together. So we wanted to run a test run paper on just one element of the neighborhood environment and cognitive aging. And so what we did was actually focus on coffee shops and fast food sites. In traditional public health literature, these are often labeled as unhealthy sites, understandably so, given the foods that are served there that are high, for example, in saturated fats and salts and other elements. But the qualitative work that we've done really showed that older adults maybe use this space in a different way. They're not necessarily often going through a drive-through to grab a lot of food and get out the door. It's actually a place to go and socialize and connect. So when we talk to older adults about their everyday behaviors, these were places that were familiar and comfortable. They were everyday sites that often folks have frequented for a long time. They're also very social. They're a place to grab a $1 cup of coffee and sit for hours. I had many older men, for example, say, I'm not old, I'm not going to a senior center, but I'll go to my coffee group every Wednesday and sit for a couple hours. They were also accessible. These were sites, for example, often located along transit lines, or they had large parking lots to get to. They are sometimes the only walkable sites that were available in an area. I had one person tell me their daily walk was to a Caribou coffee shop, because that was the only site in suburban neighborhood you could get to. They are also economically accessible because you could buy, for example, that cup of coffee for $1, and it was a local place you could go to and afford to be in. And really just unfolded into everyday routines. Like I mentioned, that's a regular, comfortable place to go every day or on a regular basis, at least pre-COVID, to engage with other folks. So we used this qualitative analysis to test in the regard sample if there were any links to cognitive aging. And we did see a significant and positive association. So on the y-axis, we have someone's predicted individual cognitive function score. So a lower score indicates worse cognitive function, a higher score indicates higher cognitive function, better cognitive health. On the x-axis, we have the density of eateries in a local area, those coffee shops and fast food sites. So 0 means that an individual has no such, no eateries or fast food located in their local area. Whereas a 0.6 is a really high density of sites. Think of downtown New York or downtown LA or other urban, very, very dense downtown environments with an abundance of those local sites. So we can see a significant and positive association kind of when we go from nothing to something. We can see an increase here on this plot, but then it kind of tapers off, which I think intuitively makes sense. Whether you have 5 coffee shops or 50 coffee shops in your local area, at some point you probably reached a point of saturation in your neighborhood where those additional X number of sites may not be an additional boost to your kind of everyday social behaviors and ability to get out the door. So this kind of made sense to us when we looked at it, and also gave us some ideas about potentially kind of unexpected sites of public health promotion and ideas to maybe anchor community programs like coffee groups or reading clubs in these accessible and comfortable sites for older adults. So I think here is an example of how qualitative research can give sometimes an unexpected hypothesis or take on more classic research questions. So now on to what we call the building blocks of cognability. Like I said, we're going to put a lot of papers in front of you in a really fast amount. So the first paper we tackled was of social connection. So we wanted to think through where adults are kind of connecting and socially supported on a regular everyday basis. So those places for social connection and support, what came out as most generalizable or universal in the qualitative results were first senior centers. These are accessible and local sites to go and engage in, have a cup of coffee, socialize with older adults. Often these sites have social workers that are running programming for older adults. We also saw civic and social organization, places such as park boards, neighborhood groups, VFWs, veterans organizations, places that are really designed to be social and to be engaged in civic and volunteer activities. And then we also saw food and drinking sites come up. So we expanded this category from our test run paper of just coffee shops and fast food to include places like restaurants and bars and cafeterias, I think, and other kind of communal places to eat and drink together. So these gave us our ways to what to focus on in the quantitative analysis in the regard study. So here we can see a significant and positive association for civic and social organizations. So having an abundance of civic and social organizations in your local area had a significant and positive association with better cognitive function scores. We also saw a significant and positive association for senior centers, which you can see here in orange on the right-hand side. Interestingly, when we expanded that eateries category to include more broad eating and drinking establishments, we didn't find a significant association between having them in your local area and cognitive function scores. So next up, we use that as a way to think about prioritizing investment in these communities, in these sort of sites that really promote socialization, connection, and care among aging adults. The next question was physical activity. So what sites are kind of supporting everyday active aging among older communities? What came out as most generalizable across the qualitative results were first walkable destinations. So being able to, for example, walk to the grocery store or to pick up medicine or to pick up a grandchild from school or other kind of everyday activities, just be able to walk or even bus there. We also heard a lot about parks. These weren't necessarily large-scale national parks. They were often small, what we call pocket parks. They were located in a neighborhood nearby. It helped if they were well lit, if they had good plowing, and they had benches and shade to be more accessible for those navigating physical disabilities. We also heard a lot about recreation centers. So these are places like YMCAs and gyms, pools, golf for some individuals, and just places to get together to exercise, but also, of course, to socialize. So these papers are divided by lifestyle activity, but of course, we know that going to a gym, for example, can be a very social activity for individuals, especially if you're engaging in group exercise classes. So in the quantitative analysis, we again found significant and positive associations. So we captured walkable destinations as kind of retail businesses per square mile in a local area, and we did see a significant and positive association. We also found a significant and positive association for having more parks in your local area, and to a lesser extent, but we did see kind of positive trend for a recreation center as well, to have an abundance of those in your local area. Keep moving fast, so feel free to pop up if you have questions, or again, we can go in the Q&A. I just want to get to Mike's part, which is really exciting. So this led us to kind of find, start to build together these sites like walkable destinations, park and rec centers, and really make the case for investing in multi-generational activity spaces. So not just having a playground for children, for example, but having some equipment for older adults to exercise, or a bench to sit and be shaded so they could engage in those spaces more easily and comfortably. We then wanted to focus on cognitive stimulation. For sake of time, I'm not going to run through all of it, but what the qualitative analysis focused our attention on was places for creative and complex activities. So older adults talked about using libraries, taking classes and attending events at higher education campuses, and going to arts and cultural sites such as museums and concerts to engage in creative and complex activities. What we found in the quantitative analysis was just arts and cultural sites, and that showed a significant and positive association for cognitive function among the regards participants. Now, we also know that neighborhoods are not exclusively positive, and that it's not just about amenities, but can you actually get there? Are there barriers to which we know are unequally cited across our communities? So we wanted to focus a paper on disamenities in someone's neighborhood and local area. This work was led by Wen-Chan Yu, one of our doctoral mentees, and she was focused on barriers and hazards to engaging in these kind of healthy cognitive aging behaviors. I should note too that, of course, the sites we focused on do share a link along the biological pathway. For example, highways not just cut off your access to sites, but they're also sources of air, noise, and water pollution. But we really wanted to focus on those barriers to activity, to mobility, and that really discourage engagement in local amenities. So here we found a significant and negative association with walkability. We wanted to test that association. And we also saw that having a higher density of highways in your local area was a significant and negative association, and also polluting sites. This was a binary variable, so we don't have a plot for it, but having polluting sites in your local neighborhood did share a significant and negative association with cognitive function. And now I'm going to pass it off to Mike, who's going to take over for our continuing work on this.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. And we can do, I'll just ask you when to switch. We can have the hand signal if you want. I can do like this, whatever. We'll figure it out. So with those kind of building block studies complete, right? We were left ultimately with a few key descriptive insights about the world, right? So first off, we learned from all these prior studies, right, from our work, that there's this considerable place-based variation in the cognitive health of older adults living in the United States right now. And second, kind of importantly, we also revealed that this variation and well-being overlaps in some very, very, very intimate ways with the presence or absence of these kind of like, I guess, environmental sites or organizations that are located within individuals' neighborhoods. But still, right, despite, the importance of these kind of basic descriptive insights, there was one other kind of descriptive task left on the table for us to accomplish. And so indeed, while it was incredibly useful, at least in my view, that's a little bit self-promoting, to identify these connections in this piecemeal, stepwise fashion to establish some basic ideas, we ultimately wanted to be able to make a much stronger, more clear-eyed statement on which of these neighborhood features or which combination of these neighborhood features were most consequential in driving this person-to-person variation in cognitive health that we see across kind of the geographic landscape of the US. So putting that just a little bit differently, right? What we wanted to do next was take this full batch of neighborhood features that we selected based on Jessica's impeccable kind of like qualitative field work and sort through them all together to get a much more kind of precise picture of which of these factors were more or less essential in explaining this tremendous amount of place-based variation that we see embedded in cognitive health outcomes among older adults. Get to the next one.
I gave you slide control. Do you want to give it a shot?
Oh,
It's new to me that you can do this. Can you flip it?
I'm pressing the button. Okay, it does it. It's slow, but it works. That's modern technology. Amazing. Right. And so to kind of accomplish this kind of like last descriptive task for the moment, what we essentially did was stack all of those neighborhood features that we previously examined into one so-called whole neighborhood model that was essentially this generalized additive multi-level model of cognition that we kind of relied on to kind of estimate some of the stuff that I just talked about a little bit before, but we tweaked kind of the estimation kind of process just a bit to kind of reflect our new goals. And indeed, we can talk more about the details of that method in the Q&A. Jessica gets mad at me when I start rambling about this too long, and then she's totally right. But the basic gist of these kind of modified models is that we started off under the very, very, very heavy assumption that none of those neighborhood features that we kind of like identified and looked through in our building blocks papers actually had any effect on cognitive health whatsoever. So just paste a huge Bayesian prior over kind of the effects of all of these different kind of neighborhood features, shrinking them down to zero. And then let the data tell us kind of like among this full set, kind of which ones kind of like exert strong enough kind of like a predictive influence over kind of older adults' cognitive health outcomes to break free of this prior assumption of no association. Now, ultimately, what we get from all of this is a parsimonious model of cognitive health that demonstrates the configuration of neighborhood conditions that appear to be most consequential for structuring older adults' cognitive health, while also kind of like accounting for the availability of all the other kind of resources, hazards, sites, built environmental sites that are located within an individual's kind of environment. Now, again, we can talk more about the details of that estimation process in the Q&A for those that kind of want to nerd out a little bit more. But for the sake of time, let's go ahead and just take a look at the substantive results that came out of this modeling process as whole, right? And so indeed, this kind of like slide shows off the results from this so-called whole neighborhood model, and namely the 6 predictors that appear to be most significantly predictive of cognitive welfare, again, controlling for the availability of all the other kind of types of resources and hazards that are located within an individual's environment. And so there's a whole lot kind of going on here, but to kind of walk us through kind of the logic of what's happening really quickly, right? Let's go ahead and focus our attention in on this first box up here in red. Now, as you can see from the label, right, this facet shows off the association between the density of social organizations that are located in an individual's environment. Oh, can you not see my mouse when I move it? Jess?
It's me moving it, Michael.
Okay, great. All right, no worries. Yeah, okay, we'll
I'll
do
be your
this.
pointer.
Thank you, thank you. So this kind of box shows off the association between the density of social organizations that are located in an older adult's neighborhood environment, which is located on the x-axis, and you can see that sites measured per 1,000 kind of census tract residents, so neighborhood residents. And then the expected cognitive function score of an individual that's located within kind of a site with this level of kind of civic and social organizations available to them. And so here, right, we can see this considerable positive effect of civic and social organizations such that folks who are living in areas with 3 social organizations per 1,000 neighborhood residents tended to have cognitive scores that are about 0.4 points higher than folks living in areas that were completely absent of those sites, so 0 kind of civic and social organizations per 1,000 kind of residents, right? And that's, again, holding all of the access to all of these other kind of sites and hazards kind of like constant across these 2 hypothetical individuals. Now, kind of the difference here between kind of 0 and 3 in cognitive function scores about 0.4 points, like I said, and that's a little bit kind of hard to parse, as like Jessica said earlier, given that it's a factor score, but it's a very, very kind of rough heuristic. It's not the way you use that word, but we all know what I'm talking about. That's about equivalent to about a 2 or 3 year difference in age's effect on kind of like cognitive kind of function as it's measured here, or as we measure in our model, which, you know, is nothing to kind of sneeze at. That is for just 0 to a few more kind of civic and social sites located in an individual's neighborhood environment buys like a considerable kind of improvement in cognitive health equivalent to 2-3 years of age. Now, on the other side of the ledger, it also looks like kind of like exposure to highways were kind of like responsible or associated with the most detrimental impacts on cognitive function. You can see that in blue right here, as Jessica's highlighting, with folks living in neighborhood environments that were free of highways, like entirely all the way on the left side, demonstrating about a 0.4, 0.5, or again, about a 2 to 3 year kind of age advantage in cognitive health, in terms of cognitive health outcomes, compared to individuals that were living in areas that were layered with highway infrastructure. This x-axis is a little different here because it's not sites per 1,000 population, but it's talking about the amount of kind of like highway tracks that are layered throughout kind of a kind of census tract. But the idea here is that, you know, that 80 is a whole lot, that 0 is an area that's free of highway tracks. So there's a whole lot kind of else going on here that we can talk about later. But in general, the rest of the plot shows us that arts, museums, and recreation organizations rendered kind of like slight positive boost to cognitive functions, nowhere near as big as civic and social organizations. While interestingly enough, and this kind of shows off some of the difficulties or the challenges with trying to kind of like measure kind of neighborhoods using different kind of spatial definitions. We see that coffee shops and fast food actually produce kind of like slight harms for those other individuals living nearby. And we can talk a little in contrast to kind of what we found earlier. And we can talk about some reasons for why that is. But still, the big takeaway is that according to this model, the most consequential culprits behind place-based variation in cognitive function scores that we kind of see embedded in all our data appears to be kind of like this access to social organizations or this exposure to kind of like highway infrastructure. All right. Now, that's a critical kind of insight that we can unpack more together in a second during the discussion. But before we get to that, we also did want to note that our examinations thus far have really washed over critical issues of power that Jessica mentioned earlier, including some structurally imposed barriers that may cause sites to be less accessible despite their spatial proximity to particular individuals and communities. So indeed, due to kind of racism, sexism, and classism embedded in many of these sites like art institutions, restaurants, whatever, it may very well be the case that kind of these sites kind of look very different in terms of the cognitive health benefits that they confer to individuals, and being agnostic to that fact is underscribing the world, underscribing these associations in a way that we really want to address. So to take that kind of like insight into consideration, we do want to note that we also fit several interactive models in this kind of like whole neighborhood kind of like framework that allowed the influence of each of our focal neighborhood predictors to vary by the race, gender, and educational attainment of a respondent. And some of the results are the findings that are summarized up above, right? And so the Cliff Notes versions of our finding in this kind of like supplementary analysis is that we didn't actually find really kind of like clear evidence to suggest kind of subpopulation variation and effects here. The reasons for why, oh, why is this not going to the next one? Oh, there we go. So the reasons for why we didn't find clear evidence is, again, something that we can talk about a little bit later. It's more of a kind of computational than a conceptual kind of thing, right? I truly believe that there should be subpopulation variation here. But these are very expensive models to kind of like run. And so you need kind of very targeted hypotheses. It's essentially being like, we're testing whether the full vector of kind of neighborhood kind of features vary in their salience across like kind of these different population groups, instead of kind of narrowing it in on kind of like one or two. I will say that we did find some stuff that did kind of match up with kind of a priori kind of like thinking. For instance, that religious organization density was very significantly and positively associated with cognitive health among older kind of Black adults, but not kind of like older white adults, which again, it kind of like bumps up against some other kind of like research by folks like Robert Taylor at Michigan and friends, that oh Haley, thank you, that kind of like talks about kind of the importance of these sites for kind of older Black adults, right? But still, we wanted to kind of avoid and be really honest and avoid kind of like cherry picking results and backfitting kind of like our hypotheses to kind of like match our data analysis. That is not good science, but there's a huge opportunity for some real, I think, critical theoretical kind of investigations here. There we go. But all right, so that's a broad view of what we've done so far. And all the work that here, right, kind of despite the reliance on some fairly sophisticated modeling, it's meant to be descriptive and hypothesis generating, and that's a springboard for even more targeted research down the line, some of which we're already engaged in, and some of which we were really eager to have a big discussion with y'all kind of like about. But still, kind of before getting to that, I do kind of, we do want to kind of like wrap up by just kind of contextualizing things just a bit more in a broader sense. And then also kind of laying out some things that we're doing, working on in the moment in relation to what you've seen today to kind of further build out kind of like the cognability concept from these basic, some of the basic kind of insights that we got here. Okay, Jess, I'll give it back to you real quick.
Sure. So I'll just jump in a little briefly just to kind of share, we're excited that it's kind of a new concept. Like Mike said, it's a very, different approach in that we're really mixing methods. We're bringing together different fields. We're really focused and prioritizing having racially and socioeconomically diverse samples in both our qualitative and quantitative research. And really, Cognability is a project, yes, aiming to identify upstream determinants of cognitive aging disparities, but really it's also in a broader sense trying to understand these interconnections between neighborhoods, behaviors, and health. So it's not just the cognitive aging outcomes, but this relationship that is relevant to so many health outcomes and health disparities that we see in our modern American society. And really a tool to hopefully continue to investigate and address issues of access and inequity, given how unequal our neighborhoods are across the country and across the world. And so it's really aiming to provide evidence to, for example, the age-friendly cities communities efforts by the World Health Organization, dementia friendly, and providing a tool to kind of critically assess neighborhoods and think through these connections and inform where to target our limited resources through upstream community level interventions. So just briefly, as Mike mentioned, we're going to share some of our next steps. One of our goals of the project was to make this accessible to folks, to share how these connections may exist, to get folks thinking about their neighborhoods and communities, to get, whether it's an individual who's aging or someone thinking about a family member, but also to policymakers and community service providers to think about, again, where to target resources and where to invest in spaces. So we made a Cognability website. The link is down here. It's cognability.isr.umich.edu. This is a very early website, I will say. It's a summary of our work, but again, regardless neighborhoods is just one quantitative sample. It's amazing in many ways, but it has limitations. So I just note that a caveat that when we share what we've done, it is again early and exploratory work. We're not ready, for example, for cognability scores for every census tract to be plugged into other analyses and indicator of neighborhood. It's still in its own right something in development. But regardless, we wanted to give folks a way to type in an address, and of course, maps are a very powerful tool. I'm a geographer at heart, so I always want to try and make maps. So we wanted to share, that connection between neighborhoods and cognitive aging and healthy behaviors. So the website just goes into how we created it. We basically scored every urban and suburban census tract across the United States from a score of 0 to 100. So 50 is an average score. And again, you can be lower or higher than that. And we were building upon the analysis that Mike described in detail of those key places like civic and social organizations being a big positive and highways kind of being a bigger negative, with other elements also factoring into the scoring. And so that let us create a patchwork of scores for, again, all those census tracts. So you can type in an address and see what its score is, but again, please take it with a grain of salt. This is early and exploratory work, but here's just one example of what the cognability scores look like. You can see Detroit here in the patchwork of blues, which indicates high cognability, and then oranges, which is a lower cognability. Here's Ann Arbor, where the University of Michigan is located, which is a mostly blue area. So high blues are going to have, for example, a higher density of those civic and social organizations, arts, museums, and recreation centers. And then orange is going to be sites with higher amounts of highways, polluting sites, coffee shops, and fast food. So you can see, some strongly graded spatial trends. Again, this is already controlling for other neighborhood SES factors, but we can see even after accounting for that, we're seeing, for example, the downtown Detroit corridor with high service access and amenities, and then having more underserviced neighborhoods and communities surrounding that area, which overlaps, for example, patterns of neighborhood SES and other elements. So this is just one visual example of how it looks, and happy to unpack it further in Q&A if there's interest, but feel free to look it up and send us your comments. Again, it's not going to count everything, so there's lots of limitations to this work. And Mike, I'll pass it back to you.
Yes, and so I'll go ahead and finish this. So do lightning round on this. We talked too long, I know. So in addition to kind of like doing this public facing work, we're also kind of like working on validating and extending the concept beyond, like in a kind of scientific circles. Specifically, we're kicking up an RO1 that further sorts through the fine-grained details of how neighborhood environments participate in the production of cognitive health over the entire life course, right? So indeed, right, as we've been gesturing to kind of throughout the talk today, the studies that we've done thus far have been quite descriptive, focusing on establishing kind of foundational associations between spatial kind of features and cognitive health. But still, there's so much more to be done here, so much more to fill in here. And for instance, like one thing that we're really kind of concerned about, like I think the first thing that we're going to target is that kind of our studies today have really focused on the overlap between neighborhood conditions and cognitive health as they exist among a cohort of individuals that are already well into kind of adulthood or an older age. Now, this is super useful, of course, but it's also kind of a bit limited in that it ignores that people don't just kind of drop into these kind of environments and are exposed to these different neighborhood features kind of throughout their entire lives. And instead, we know that kind of like all sorts of like kind of early life kind of exposures, like early life exposure to pollution or lead or physical kind of like conditions, right, have consequences for cognitive welfare, cognitive health way down the line. And so it's entirely plausible that someone's entire residential history and the package of amenities and the hazards therein could be very, very kind of crucial for understanding cognitive health disparities that arise, 30, 40 years kind of down the line. So among other things, right, we're planning on investigating this with kind of HRS data. We're lucky enough to be able to have access to kind of respondents' residential histories to kind of understand their exposure to various neighborhood conditions across their entire lives from childhood to old age. And so we're ultimately hoping on trying to kind of develop a much better kind of understanding, long run perspective on how unequal neighborhood conditions generate health disparities over the long run, and not just kind of narrow insights into kind of like the end point of like what's probably this long run kind of life course process. And then finally, right, we're also, and we're starting up a bit of work to understand the implications of COVID on some of the processes that we've mapped out above. And just as a very kind of Cliff Notes version, right, if neighborhood sites are crucial for facilitating access to these proximal ADRD risk factors like exercise or regular social interaction, and the availability and presence of these sites and the use of these sites have been kind of disrupted in a considerable way by the pandemic, then it follows that this changing neighborhood landscape that's left behind for COVID may, you know, in a couple of years, have these really profound and unanticipated consequences for the current cognitive health of current cohorts of older adults. And so monitoring the potential implications and theorizing the potential implications of this feels quite important. And thus, that's some of the work that we've been engaging in as well at the moment. But okay, we talked way too long, so I'm going to go ahead and just post the key takeaways, and then we can go ahead and open up the floor for discussion. Thank you so much for kind of joining us today, and we are looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael and Jessica, for that packed presentation. We don't have enough time for discussion, but we're going to try a little bit. And the good thing is people asking questions are on campus with you, Michael, so we can make sure that you all connect. I see that Ganesh has several questions. Do you want to come off? Do you want to come on, Ganesh, and tell us what you want to get answered in the short time that we have? You have such big and important questions.
I think probably the last one would be the most interesting, and I'd like to get your thoughts on structural racism. And I think you alluded to that in the presentation and how you might incorporate that, because that's an important upstream factor that really innervates everything that we're looking at in terms of brain health, aging.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you for that. So the very short version. So like, because my other work is like on kind of conceptualizing structural racism. And the more and more that I sit in that space, I'm like less convinced that kind of the question of how you measure kind of like structural racism is like, it's not a measurement issue per se, and that some places have more or less structural racism than others. But rather, I think it's like a theory that's kind of pointing to describing the relationships between variables and the relationships between different institutions, and that they're mutually reinforcing and always kind of like pointed towards pushing harm downstream at Black populations and pushing privileges up towards kind of like white kind of like professional class kind of communities, right? So the whole idea of measurement, I know that's like not answering your question at all, but I've like had a recent kind of like moral stand about like, we don't measure structural racism. That's not what we're doing. So I don't know if like, yeah, like it's somebody may have a different answer for you there, but I think kind of like the description of the very presence of the unequal distribution of these factors across racialized neighborhoods is the expression of structural racism, and the willpower to kind of like make that kind of like unequal distribution, the force that makes that unequal distribution possible is structural racism in and of itself. So I know that's not a real answer to your question, but it's
we'll have to connect since we're both on campus. And
there you go. Yeah.
Jessica, really quick. So I've actually lived in both places, in Eden Prairie and Minneapolis, and I went to the University of Minnesota. And I was just, they're very different, environments. I mean, like worlds apart. And I was just wondering why the choice, and in terms of how do you compare, the sort of the haves versus the have-nots and the investments, by all these different agencies.
Yeah, no, it's a great question and a deep one. I think, the sites were selected for kind of, as you said, have and have not communities, but I think something that surprised me was downtown Minneapolis, because I had some of the most affluent communities there, older adults who chose to move to condos to be close to services and amenities, living literally next door to subsidized housing, Section 8 buildings. And so these communities actually were wildly different. Folks would take me on a walking and tell me those where the rich people live, or that's where we live, or vice versa. They were sharing the same environment, but inhabiting it in really different ways. So I think that's one example where the environment would be measured the same, but the use of it was totally different. So in some ways, these sites, even the same site, can be two different worlds. And of course, I only had so much time in NSF funds to do, conduct case study areas, but even across very different communities, the umbrella places that we chose capture distinction between the particular places people might choose. So in, let's just say, recreation centers, it was golf courses for wealthy white men, for example. It was the subsidized YMCA purposely built in a Black community to support those folks in North Minneapolis. It was, so even though it was the specifics of that site was different, we can still measure them by the same spatial category to put it into our analysis. So we can capture and collect some of that variation by building measures that are quantitative that are broad enough to capture variation by person and place. But like Mike said, there's so much more to do to tease out differences by different groups. It's a huge work in progress.